Since the dawn of otaku culture in the 20th century, anime has quickly risen to one of the most popular objects of nerd affection. From the get-go, Japanese animation warranted its classification as a form of media rather than a mere genre due to the multitude of subtypes of anime. We've touched on several of these genres before: science fiction, family, experimental, postmodern comedy, but there's one major area here that we haven't looked into just yet. Today's subject, MAQUIA, where the promised flower blooms, is the perfect opportunity to look into the broad history of fantasy anime. The film also provides a place from which to explore a new voice in the medium.
MAQUIA, released last week on Blu-ray and DVD in the US by 11 Arts Anime and Shout Studios, follows MAQUIA, a young woman born to the Eorf clan. The Eorf are a race of beings who age slowly, live seemingly forever, and separate themselves from the humans of their world. As it turns out, the monarch of a nearby kingdom is seeking the eternal life of the Eorf, and almost immediately sends in some of his best mounted men to capture one of the women. His hope is to force her to marry into the royal family, thus unifying the races while also ensuring the continuance of his bloodline.
Things don't exactly go to plan when MAQUIA is accidentally carried off from the Eorf homeland, meaning that the clan is not entirely destroyed. Coming across a baby human boy, MAQUIA adopts him and raises him as her own. Where we might expect the film to play out over a short period, we instead follow MAQUIA and Ariel, her adopted son, through the decades after their first meeting. Ultimately, the film suffers in some ways from stretching itself thin time-wise, meaning that some of the more fantastical elements of MAQUIA's world and plot are left to the imagination. This is fantasy, of course, but more demanding audience members will likely be frustrated by the underexplained nature of MAQUIA.
While these fantasy oversights might provide issue for some viewers, we would be hard-pressed to argue against the quality of the film's visuals and the integrity of the film's theming. The first point shines through with the fluidity of MAQUIA's animation and the brilliance of the film's color palette. From the dull grays and browns of the industrialized city to the bright greens and blues of the Eorf homeland, there's never a dull visual moment throughout MAQUIA. This is to say nothing of the art style used for 3D models, which are rendered in such a way that they mesh almost perfectly with the 2D portions of the film.
In terms of theming, MAQUIA places more interest in asking existential questions rather than attempting to explain the intricacies of its world. This is the type of story that requires some amount of fantasy, but which provides a mind-boggling thought experiment. In MAQUIA, one particular question is raised in a more impacting manner than perhaps anywhere else we've seen it. Essentially, through exploring the relationship between MAQUIA and Ariel, the film asks us if emotional attachment between mortals and immortals is worth it, or if it harms both parties. We've seen this question raised through other stories, mostly with those involving vampires, but in most of these other examples, we're looking at individuals who are romantically involved. With MAQUIA, however, we're looking at two people who are family. In other words, we're looking at a different type of love here.
Two camps of thought exist within the film: that the Eorf should never fall in love with mortals, and that the Renato should try and free themselves from their bondage. The irony here presents yet more existential questions. The Eorf tell mortals to live their lives to the fullest, seeing as how the Eorf have the perspective of how short mortal lives are. At the same time, they tell their own kind not to live their lives to the fullest, but to suppress their emotions for the sake of not being hurt. They lord their holier-than-thou attitude as immortals over the mortals of the world, while ironically making themselves unhappier than the mortals. The film thus seems to encourage us to recognize our own mortality, and to seize what time we have, to be unafraid to live no matter how much emotional harm may come to us. Without the joy of living, there would be no pain, as well as the reverse.
What's remarkable about this tale is how it's couched in such relatively unremarkable language, that of the Western fantasy genre. The world is populated by medieval European architecture and social strata, complete with barmaids and nobles. The Renato, while bearing designs likely inspired to some extent by Evangelion, are still recognizable as European dragons.
I think technically those are wyverns.
The Eorf are androgynous, fair-skinned, borderline angelic immortals who condescend to mankind, not unlike the elves described by J.R.R. Tolkien. Thus, if you're a fan of these tropes and the fantasy genre at large, but are looking for something more philosophically stimulating, MAQUIA might be up your alley. this still raises the question, how did we get from this to this?
Truth be told, high fantasy and anime have been closely related for longer than some might expect. Since the introduction of the PC games Wizardry and Ultima, both in 1981, and the tabletop RPG Dungeons & Dragons into Japan in 1985 and their immediate success upon arrival, Japanese otaku took to the idea of the Western fantasy landscape populated by wizards and paladins. A decade prior, The Lord of the Rings had arrived officially under the title Yubiwa Monogatari, or Ring Story, but this seems to have been a less monumental affair. While Tolkien's novels were more underground in Japan at first, Wizardry, Ultima, and Dungeons & Dragons arrived in the era of the home computer. As nerds out there will know, otaku are an industrious people, willing to make their fantasies reality if someone else hasn't already.
As you may have surmised from that description, the popularity of these three games in Japan had a direct impact on the development and release of such colossal games as Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, two of the most recognizable fantasy properties in existence today. Earlier in the 1980s, otaku programmers were hard at work adapting their fantasy campaigns to computer RPGs as well, meaning that the community extended far beyond just these monoliths of gaming. The impact of these Western games also didn't stop with Japanese gaming, instead spawning novel series and anime, like perhaps the most notable example, Record of Lodoss War, itself initially being composed of dramatic retellings of D&D campaigns.
Given the contemporary popularity of video games and anime in the 1980s and 1990s, plus the decreased cost of VHSs as well as home computers, it should come as no surprise that this influence meant fantasy anime was not far off. There have been several notable examples throughout the following decades, including some properties which have dipped their fingers in multiple media. This means that MAQUIA provides the latest in a long-running tradition that can be traced to the works of Tolkien and before, through the nerdiest games of the 1980s and into the modern day. What's equally fascinating is the personal story presented with the production of this specific project and the woman behind the film, Mari Okada.
Mari Okada has been renowned as a writer of quality anime for 20 years now, with such popular projects as Anohana, Black Butler, and many others to her name. However, this modern reputation as a master of emotional writing betrays her humble beginnings. Due to social anxiety, Okada spent the bulk of her time in middle school at home. An otaku herself, she took her time as a hikikomori retreating into the world of video games. After another few years spent in seclusion throughout high school, Okada decided to brave the world outside and attend university for video game writing. This path transitioned instead into a career as an anime screenwriter, a position she held from 1998 onward.
Throughout the 2000s, Okada directed several short films. What makes MAQUIA remarkable for her, however, is that it marks Okada's first feature film as both writer and director. Thus, while the voice of the project might be familiar to fans of her prior works, the style is marked by her relative newness to the director's chair. In this respect, MAQUIA becomes the result of one lengthy success story. Okada's struggles with being a hikikomori are chronicled in her autobiography, published in 2017, translated into English in 2018, and adapted for TV later that year. MAQUIA, released in 2018 in Japan and 2019 in the States, would indicate that Okada is not only beyond this strife-ridden portion of her life, but that she has also taken a major step in her career, from screenwriter and creator to anime director.
MAQUIA, When the Promised Flowers Bloom, is an interesting case study for multiple reasons. It provides the opportunity to analyze why and how Western fantasy has interacted with anime. It allows for a clear point of demarcation between phases of Mari Okada's career, and it raises some philosophical questions about life and the nature of existence that we haven't necessarily seen covered with such finesse. If you're a fan of fantasy or the works of Okada, you'll likely find MAQUIA appealing, while those who aren't captivated by fanciful worlds like this might do better to look at her other projects instead. Regardless of personal opinion, MAQUIA is not a project we will soon forget, which aligns perfectly with one of its central ideas: how we remember or forget the events and people throughout our lives. Check out MAQUIA and let us know what you think of the film in the comments below. Until then, we'll see you next time.